Hello, everyone. My name is Jamillah Bowman Williams. I am an associate professor of law at Georgetown University. I'm also the faculty director of the Workers' Rights Institute at Georgetown. I specialize in employment law and anti-discrimination law. So I'm here today joined with Indi Dutta Gupta, and we're going to discuss the huge economic shock that's caused by COVID-19, as well as its devastating impact on workers. So as a scholar who focuses primarily on inequality and bias, we're going to talk about all workers, but I'm going to pay particular emphasis to low-wage workers, Black workers, Indigenous populations, and immigrants, and other vulnerable populations who have been hit really hard, particularly hard by this pandemic. So a few things that are happening now that we're going to touch on. One, we know that people have begun receiving their stimulus checks. There's a larger stimulus payment to the people that's being talked about. Maybe it's been introduced to Congress. Maybe we'll see that coming forward. We'll talk a little bit about that potential. Small business loans ran out, and there's lots of publicity to these big corporations who have been getting these funds, and many small businesses, mom and pops, have been left out. And then lastly, on the forefront on many of our minds is the fact that the states are talking about reopening soon. So what does this all mean for workers? We have a lot to talk about. So those are some of the things that'll be on the agenda today. So now I'll turn it over to Indi to introduce himself.
Thank you, Jamillah. I am Indi Dutta Gupta, co-executive director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality and an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown Law Center. And I'm pleased to join Jamillah and all the listeners here for this conversation. I think we're going to, as Jamillah just mentioned, really focus a lot on the groups who are hardest hit by COVID-19. So just to reiterate, we've got people who are among the lowest paid workers in the country, and especially a lot of people of color, especially Black and brown folks, as well as Alaskan Natives and American Indians. We're going to talk a lot about unemployment and what some of the potential solutions there are for addressing the crisis, including some of the solutions already in place now. We're going to talk about workplace health and safety. This is always important, but especially amidst a contagious disease pandemic. We'll talk about stimulus checks, or recovery rebates as they're called in the last enacted piece of COVID-19 response legislation. Leave policy as well, sick days and longer term paid leave, which is going to be crucial, not just for economic, but for public health reasons, and worker rights to organize, which we're seeing a lot of activity around leading up to this crisis, but especially now in the context of what a lot of workers are dealing with. So, that's sort of the overview. Jamillah, does it make sense for me to just jump in and talk a little about some of the disparities?
Yeah, let's start with some of the overarching disparities that we've been seeing. So,
look, people, I think quite mistakenly, referred to COVID-19 initially as an equal opportunity disease. It's not. It is really piling on and compounding existing structural inequalities. We've seen some of the hardest impact on people who experience poverty, who are in working class jobs. Think about who has no choice but to ride public transportation, people who are most likely to be deemed essential, even though we, in many cases, didn't really value them before this crisis. So we're expecting not only disproportionate health harms to these groups, and again, especially communities of color, but also, frankly, just higher poverty. Some of our friends at Columbia University and elsewhere have estimated that poverty could reach the highest recorded rates since 1967, just looking at what's already happened to joblessness. We've had a crisis, obviously, in housing as well. And I want to say before I back to you, Jamillah, a lot of people may not appreciate it, but it looks like women are getting disproportionately hit by this crisis, with a supermajority of frontline jobs are really held by women right now. And when you look at all the jobs held by women, 1 in 3 have been deemed essential.
Yes, so I want to talk when we get to our section on workplace safety. I want to talk in particular about people of color and women who are disproportionately in these essential jobs, as we're calling them, or the frontline jobs. And many of these people also don't have health insurance in many of these jobs. So we'll talk about that even more specifically. I also wanted to talk, before we get to that, just about more of the overarching racial disparities. So you talked some about the way poverty influences all this, but COVID is hitting Black populations and Indigenous populations, other people of color particularly hard. So I have a chart that I wanted to share with you all that just gives some example of this. So this just shows the share of the population across these states for African Americans compared to the share of the deaths. So places like Louisiana, where Blacks only make up 30% of the population, yet they're 70% of the COVID deaths. Illinois, 15% of the population, but 42% of the deaths. We're seeing something similar in Michigan and North Carolina. Indigenous populations being hit very hard as well. A lot of times we don't pay a lot of attention to the Native community, right? They're small in numbers, they live in remote locations, but here in this case, that can make this even more catastrophic. So this is another group that's been hit very hard by it. Why? A lot of this is due to broader systemic issues that have always been there, right? So just it is a wake-up call to some extent to say, okay, COVID is giving us this problem, but we've really always seen this. So we know that some communities are less likely to have access to healthy food. They're more likely to breathe polluted air. Native community, many of them don't have running water to wash their hands, right, to deal with the COVID virus. When we think about access to healthcare, they don't live close to hospitals. They don't get to see physicians regularly. They don't have insurance. So a lot of these things are causing the underlying health conditions that are then just being exacerbated by the COVID virus. So I just wanted to point out those specific racial disparities first. And then in addition to that, just building off of what you were talking about a little bit more, Indi, these low wage jobs, right? So the people who can't afford to take off of work. So they're really feeling this economic pressure and this financial pressure to go to work. So they don't want to risk their lives, but that's their livelihood and they have to survive and put food on the table. One thing I wanted to make sure to note is this recommendation for people to just work from home. There's a lot of talk, well, you can work from home, people should work from home. The vast majority of Americans cannot work from home. So less than 30% are even able to do that. So, and we also know that that's varies quite a bit by race and ethnicity. So from the stats that I saw, about 17% of Latinos can work from home, about 20% of Blacks, compared to 30% of whites and 40% of Asians. But it's still, most people don't have that option.
Yeah, and there are other groups too, right? Like immigrants. We may not have all the best data here, but we know, for example, that 3 in 4 non-citizen immigrants work in industries that lost jobs in March. We've talked about 20% of Latinx, 20% of Indigenous folks, and 10% of Blacks don't have health insurance, as you mentioned, right? So if you think about all the groups that are really getting hit the hardest by COVID-19, in some ways, it's just really no surprise. You mentioned the lack of access to health insurance or actual healthcare for many folks, Jamillah. And of course, if you're undocumented in this country, you have extremely limited access to healthcare and essentially no access to health insurance, with some rare exceptions, for some groups in the state of California. But yeah, I just keep thinking about how every crisis really lays bare the ongoing inequities that were always there. And they were unfortunately all too easy to ignore before. But you talk about the fact that a lot of communities of color are more likely to breathe polluted air, right? And first of all, that's harmful on its own. But then when it combines with a disease that seems to be exacerbated by chronic lung conditions or moderate to severe asthma, and other sort of respiratory related risk factors, you're seeing a sort of perfect storm. And then it's no surprise that, unfortunately, a disproportionate share of the deaths and really the severe cases of COVID-19 are falling on the most marginalized communities in the first place. I wanted to just, talk a little also about the unemployment response. So we have this clear challenge with the public health response, but it's deeply intertwined now, right, with our economic situation. We have really chosen to shrink the economy and economic activity to save lives. And a major question is, what are policymakers doing for all those workers who are sacrificing to save lives, right? So we had, a record over 22 million people file for unemployment insurance over the course of a few weeks. There's evidence, again, that women have been hardest hit for lots of potential reasons we could discuss. But this is primarily low-paid service, gig workers, and probably a lot of immigrant workers. I mean, imagine like a day laborer who, as we'll talk about, isn't getting any help by and large from the government.
Yeah. So for unemployment, I want to talk a little bit more. Maybe you can share with us some of the specifics about how unemployment insurance works, given that that's part of the stimulus package. But one thing that I also wanted to mention is just one, the magnitude of jobs that are influenced by this. So we know that about 1/3 of jobs are vulnerable here. Out of all US jobs, 1/3 are vulnerable to be just slashed through the COVID virus. 86% of those jobs are low income jobs. So I have another chart here to share with you, just with some of the industries that are really feeling this the most. So we know food and beverage industry, retail, support services, the automobile industry. We have travel industry, education. So here in this chart, it shows you in pink, most of these are low wage jobs in these industries. Relatively few in red are high wage. Okay, so these are the jobs that are impacted the most. Highly represented, high representation of women, as you mentioned, other people of color, but really this is really can be devastating. So Indi, given that we know people are hit hard, what are some of the options? What are some of the benefits that may be available to those who could have been laid off through this already or otherwise are unable to work due to COVID-19?
That's a great question, Jamillah. Look, first and foremost, we have an unemployment insurance system. It certainly leaves out a lot of workers, but the basic idea is that it's a federal-state partnership where workers who have found themselves separated from employment through no fault of their own can access a weekly benefit that typically replaces maybe half or so of their prior earnings. Not in every case, for sure, and the state variation is enormous. And typically you can get the benefits for up to 6 months, but there are some places like Florida where you're lucky if you can get it for 3 months. The essence here is that the systems depend on states essentially administering the benefits and really raising the revenue for paying for them as well. Historically, the federal government has stepped in times of economic crisis, typically too late and often too little, which is a theme you'll find a lot in crisis response. But the fact is here, the federal government is doing a lot. I think it can do far more. But first of all, the federal government said, look, replacing people's wages at only, say, a 50% replacement rate doesn't seem fair or even sensible from an economic perspective, right? We want people to spend money the best they can right now. We want to stabilize people in their homes. How is a stay-at-home order going to work if people don't have a place to shelter in place? And of course, people are going to cut back for lots of reasons on spending. And if you can at least cut them checks, to boost that might help. So one of the things that was included in the CARES Act was what's called pandemic unemployment compensation. That's essentially a $600 weekly benefit increase for everyone who's getting unemployment insurance benefits. The point there was to make the average worker whole. The average unemployment insurance benefit is a little less than probably $400 a week, and the average worker probably needs about $1,000 to be made whole, but that doesn't even count for potentially increased costs for health premiums and whatnot. And then quickly, Congress also included an extra 13 weeks of unemployment insurance benefits through what's called pandemic extended unemployment compensation. If you exhaust unemployment insurance benefits, or if you for those who can't even access unemployment insurance benefits, and I can talk a little more about sort of who's left out. There's a pandemic unemployment assistance program, which is intended to catch people through the unemployment insurance system who aren't eligible for unemployment insurance benefits, aren't taking paid leave, sick or leave benefits at the moment, and have a very specific COVID-19 related reason for being unemployed, such as having COVID-19 or likely having it themselves.
Okay, so part of my question is, do people know how to navigate all this to really access? So they know they're out of work. They know they need some help and assistance. There's unemployment insurance they've heard about. There's this pandemic unemployment available. They heard about these small business loans, particularly gig workers who may kind of be self-employed or classified in a particular way. How do they know what to access, how to access it? Are people actually able to use this?
Yeah, I mean, this is really complicated. The government isn't the best at making, two different programs work well together, as those who have worked there will vouch for. I think that it's even harder in the midst of a crisis to invent new programs almost, from whole cloth, as has been done, and make them work together. So, the fact is, in some cases, say somebody who's self-employed might even be eligible for more than one benefit. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, if you think about creating a sort of economic security and stabilization system without cracks, part of the answer is to have overlap, right? And so it's very difficult to navigate. And it's different in different states. And some states are adding on additional supports and resources. So, we're certainly working on putting out some guidance. For example, if you're a childcare center, whether you're a for-profit or nonprofit, you may have access to some small business administration help, but you also have to think through the implications of unemployment insurance for your workers. And to complicate things, I think, in a potentially helpful way, in some states, you can actually use unemployment insurance to keep your workers on the job, reducing hours, giving them partial unemployment insurance benefits, continuing to pay fringe benefits. And so there are a lot of options here that really are a struggle for even deep experts who are following the legislation extremely closely to understand and appreciate. And we're waiting on guidance from the agencies. There's certainly been some, but the fact is it's been really slow going to get clarity and guidance. And Congress did write some vague legislation that the agencies really have to interpret, and we hope in as expansive and constructive way as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on that note, we're going to go to a question. So we asked if any people to submit questions on Twitter if they had any. So one person asked, Representative Jayapal and Senator Sanders have both proposed plans to pay furloughed workers through their employers rather than through the state unemployment agencies. One rationale is that state UI agencies are just overwhelmed. Is there reason to fear that these UI agencies might fail to might fail to process valid applications?
Look, on the one hand, eventually all valid applications ought to be processed by state unemployment insurance agencies. On the other, every week is painful, to say the least, if not devastating to a family that's waiting for that check. So I think there's a lot more that can be done there. But this brings up really a broader point, which is that we didn't have the social infrastructure in place to handle a crisis that was half as devastating as the COVID-19 crisis has been, is, and will continue to be. So we really need to invest in that. But secondly, whatever social infrastructure you have, almost always you don't quite know the right policy response in a crisis. So the right answer is to use every lever you really can. So that means we need to absolutely think about how to maintain tens of millions of people attached to jobs that we know we're going to need afterward. In some cases, we might need more. On the other hand, there are some jobs that aren't coming back, and we need to think hard about not only helping families and workers as they have to go through this extraordinarily painful period, but also how are we going to create the new jobs and hopefully make them better quality and ensure that they meet national needs that we're going to have going forward.
Yes, job creation is a big one. And another thing I just wanted to point out in terms of what this all demonstrates well is that we need broader policy changes moving forward. So outside of just the job creation, even when we're thinking about unemployment and how unemployment functions, when we get past this pandemic, our old system, it just isn't effective, right? It isn't efficient. We know it leaves too many workers vulnerable without their benefits. We've always known this, so this is a good opportunity to revamp and get some policy changes moving forward so more people can access these types of benefits when they need it, even beyond COVID. So on that note, I also wanted to shift gears a little bit. So we said we're going to talk about workplace health and safety. This is another really big issue. Indi brought up before, these frontline industries, these essential workers who are our most vulnerable right now because they are out and they are being exposed in huge ways to risk, right? They're literally risking their lives to go to work. So it's been estimated that over 30 million people are in these frontline jobs. So these are jobs like our nurses and our healthcare staff, our grocery store workers, farm workers, our plants, our meat plant workers, transit workers. All right, they've always been essential, but again, Indi, they are undervalued. So they're undervalued, they're underpaid, and they're underprotected. And they're also disproportionately women and people of color. All right, so when we think of safety, what are the types of things they need? They need protective equipment, right? They need PPE. They need to have hand sanitizer at a basic level available. They need running water in facilities so that they can wash their hands regularly as suggested by the CDC. They need, in some cases, barriers potentially between the worker and the customer. So this is a big one because what we've seen, at least in the last couple of weeks, that a lot of the biggest cases of COVID spread has happened in the workplace. So we learned about the meat plant, the pork plant in South Dakota, where they had 600 cases in one facility of people who were just trying to show up and go to work, right? So I want to talk a little bit about this and who we're risking through this and what we can do about it.
Yeah, that's exactly the right question, right? And it frankly, it endangers all of us, right? We need to get this virus under control. And here we are living in a country where we're depending, as you pointed out eloquently, on millions of workers who frankly have to work. And we need them to work by and large, right? We have to eat and get food. And some of us have the luxury of not having to go out and, work on a farm or, pick out groceries. But that's because other people don't have that luxury and are helping get us the food we need. And in this country, we still have no guarantee of healthcare for those workers or really anyone ultimately. And you just think about it, they're not just endangering themselves, they're endangering their loved ones. I mean, whoever they live with, whoever they have to interact with. I mean, if they have kids, there may be caregivers involved, including, elders, the parents, grandparents, who are particularly at risk here. And it's going to be a lot of immigrants, I think, who are going to be affected, where you've got only about 17% of all employed workers before the crisis in a typical year were immigrants. But in food production, for example, it's more than a fifth. It's 22% in this food supply chain. And that includes folks like migrant farm workers. And, the president has said that he's going to sign an executive order any moment now, if he hasn't already, to halt immigration. You're starting to see some carve outs because I'm sure some businesses told them how devastating it would be. But the fact is, this makes such little sense. And it really is going to endanger the families of not just immigrants more generally, but all of us every time we leave out or restrict access to supports for immigrants. So it's really, really troubling to me now. And we think about so many jobs here that, people have, treated as disposable, or just you can substitute somebody for another. And, we're struggling to fill contact tracing positions, right? There is no reason why we can't train people, potentially even online, who need this work and get them in those roles. But we have to protect them, as you pointed out. People do not, it's not in our interest. It's certainly not fair to them if people have to expose themselves needlessly to COVID-19 or more when they're doing really important work, helping this country get through this crisis.
Right. So on that note, there was one other thing that I wanted to mention is just insurance and how important access to healthcare is, and how many of these frontline workers are not protected. They don't have coverage. So here, this chart shows some of the occupations with the largest numbers of uninsured workers. So here we have our cooks, our drivers, our cashiers, our janitors, housekeeping, retail sales. So these are the most likely to be uninsured. And these are some of the jobs that are most likely to be impacted, not only in terms of our essential workers, but they're also going to be impacted if these states open prematurely. So we've been talking a lot about the economy. We need the economy going back, getting back up to full speed. We're worried about these people financially, but people can die. Like, it's literal lives at risk, and they don't have health insurance, many of them. Some do, but many don't. So while I worry about the financial side of it, overall, I'm just more worried about the unnecessary deaths that can result from this. So let's talk a little bit about the law. So we're talking about some of these different policies. I wanted to talk about OSHA. So OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So they're the federal agency that's responsible for setting laws about safety and enforcing those laws to make sure that people have safe working conditions. This is highly relevant, of course, under the current circumstances with COVID. We know right now they've issued some guidance, but there is little to no enforcement whatsoever. So there's some enforcement for healthcare workers because they've received so many complaints and so many devastating stories about what's happening to our frontline healthcare workers, but our other essential workers also need to be protected. And once the states do begin opening, all workers are going to need some safety standards that we just don't have right now. Okay, so that's the primary issue that I see, is that right now we don't have any safety standards, and the agency is able to issue these temporary emergency health and safety standards, and that's what I suggest they do ASAP, just as we start rolling forward, so that there is something to enforce. So there first needs to be a standard to enforce, and then they need to take complaints. They need to go do inspections. They need to issue citations, and if necessary, close places down temporarily if the workers' lives are in danger. So those are things that OSHA could do if they step up their game a little bit to help out, protect workers, not only essential workers, but all workers once we start opening the economy back up.
I mean, Jamillah, I completely agree. And what it underscores to me is that public health, including worker safety and health, is a foundation for our economic prosperity. There's so much talk about, as you mentioned at the beginning, about even opening up economies at the local or regional level. And honestly, it doesn't make sense if we're not protecting the workers who are most exposed. You can do it formally, but people who know the risks that they're facing, if they know how ill-protected and ill-equipped we've made these positions and the workers in these positions, they're going to be really disinclined to go out and re-engage in the sort of economic activity that we need eventually again. So anyway, I appreciate you raising these points. And in this case, we had, again, an agency that could have been acting quickly at the beginning. There were plenty of warnings. We passed one COVID-19 response bill, months ago. They were fairly silent. So it just shows also how much it matters, not only who's in charge, but I also appreciate the example you brought up about how the complaints probably made some difference here, right? So enough complaints coming in about frontline health workers. We've seen this as well in other aspects of implementation of the CARES Act and recent legislation where, media pressure, political pressure,
Yes.
public pressure actually can make the administration choose to change how it does its job in very helpful ways.
Yes, that external pressure is extremely important. On that note, I also wanted to talk about the workers' right to organize. So all workers have the right to organize and put pressure on their employers, even if they don't belong to a union. So not everyone understands this. So we've been seeing these workers who are unhappy with their lack of sick leave. They're worried and concerned about these punitive attendance policies, the lack of safety measures we've been discussing. So Amazon, cleaning services, chicken plants, grocery workers, what can they do? What rights do they have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think I just want to point out a little bit about sort of what this means before we jump into some of the specifics of the law that I know you're, a deep expert on. As you pointed out, look, from Amazon to Instacart, you're seeing workers demonstrating concerted collective sort of activity and action in ways that, I do think we were seeing some of it before the crisis, but look, finally, people are really focused on these workers in a way that they maybe haven't been before. And the way I think about it is these workers, again, are making enormous sacrifices to sustain all of us, right? I mean, that's just sort of a fact. They deserve all the protection they're demanding. And I think that we shouldn't forget after this crisis that we are so dependent on some of the lowest paid and most marginalized working people, and we have to value all of us. So it also reminds me a bit, Jamillah, of how if workers had, frankly, the sort of power that they should have had all along, say what you will about the other sort of implications of greater, say, unionization and collective bargaining agreements and worker voice, but it's hard not to see that we would have had fewer infections, hospitalizations, and frankly, deaths. And I think that that also translates into the political power we were just talking about and that influence, right? The more organized workers are, I'd argue it's better for our democracy and our economy.
Yeah, so I just want workers to understand that they do have these rights to organize. So some companies, maybe they're being proactive about taking care of their workers and keeping their workers safe, but many are only reacting when they're being forced to by their workers. So a little bit about the protections for workers and their rights to organize. So we have Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act. That allows workers to act together to address different work-related issues, right? So some of the issues that we've been talking about up until this point, they get to engage in protected, concerted activity. So this is when 2 or more employees come together to take some action for mutual aid or protection when they're thinking about the different terms and conditions of their employment. Or sometimes it can be a single person, even if that single person is acting on behalf of others. So part of this discussion, I just want people to be aware that even if you aren't represented by a union, right now, unfortunately, union elections are stalled. So they've delayed until at least July 2020, maybe beyond that. You can actually set up a new union, but that doesn't mean you don't have the right to come together and collectively organize. And then also, hopefully, they can't be discriminated against or retaliated against because of this action. Although another issue is that some of the regional offices of the National Labor Relations Board are closed. So here, that's another thing that we need to get fixed ASAP, that when workers do engage in this activity that's protected under Section 7, that they have some way to go vindicate those rights if they are punished somehow by their employer, if they're terminated or otherwise have some type of punishment that they see because of that protected activity.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important reminder, Jamillah. And, one of the things I think a lot about is, we are doing something for employers and businesses and certainly something for workers, but very little for workers collectively. And in fact, we've seen some shrinking of requirements that unionized workers be used, say, for unemployment insurance administration. So, some people are certainly taking advantage of this crisis to advance whatever, their agenda is. And I think it's important to remind people of their rights that were there before and still exist. But as you point out, everything's just, tougher now. Office closures and delaying of, eligible elections. I wanted to talk a little about some of just the money going out from the federal coffers to households and small businesses during this conversation. So maybe I'll touch on that a little bit now, and then you can tell me a little bit about what you think is missing, if that makes sense. So we've got direct payments, these recovery rebates of $1,200 per adult, $500 per eligible child, which is under the age of 17. You have to have a valid Social Security number, so that excludes a lot of folks with ITINs, or individual tax identification numbers. Many cases, we're talking about mixed status and undocumented families who are going to be left out. As we've pointed out, every time we leave out folks, we're really hurting ourselves here. Phases out these rebates starting at $75K and $175K for individual filers, $150K for joint filers. Congress, and then with a lot of pressure after the law was put in place, did really help make sure that the IRS was going to get some automatic checks out so that not everyone has to file who's eligible, especially Social Security disability insurance beneficiaries, railroad retirement beneficiaries, but also supplemental security income beneficiaries, though the IRS has put a very difficult deadline of tomorrow. By tomorrow, basically, if you have a dependent and you're a beneficiary, it's just going to affect some SSDI participants in particular. You have to go ahead and file separately for that dependent by tomorrow. So that's challenging. But by and large, what Congress said was, if you filed in 2018 or you're filing now for 2019, then you'll be eligible for this rebate. If you don't, you'll be eligible for it next year. But the point is obviously to get the money out the door now. This is still going to obviously leave a lot of folks out. I talked a little about ITIN filers, but do you want to, talk a little more, Jamillah, when you hear that, who's left out?
Yeah. So I'm thinking a lot about those without a Social Security number who have the ITIN numbers. They contribute to our economy and they pay their taxes, yet they still don't get anything out of this. Also, those who are elderly or disabled who don't, meet those requirements, they're going to be left out. College students who are dependent on their work on campus, now they could be left out of this. So I wanted to loop back around though to those who are undocumented and think about that, because that's a huge population who's unprotected and who's really being hurt a lot by all of this. So I know California at least is one state that has some specific protections for undocumented workers. Are they the only state that has that? And what do you think we can do more of there to protect the undocumented?
That's right. States can act here. So California has, a so-called sort of undocu fund, and they're going to get some money out the door that way to people who are being left out by the federal policy response. And we're hearing about this, though, elsewhere. New Jersey, if you didn't believe before, our fates are sort of mutually intertwined. I think there's nothing like a contagious disease, hopefully, to make that clear. So I think we'll see more states acting, but a lot of this is going to fall on an incredibly burdened charitable sector. And they honestly couldn't handle all the need before. There's no way they could now. The fact is, they're the one institution that's most capable of handling the sort of need and reaching people, regardless of immigration status, is the federal government. And states, I'm glad to see some of them respond. They're also being really just overwhelmed by their budget shortfalls, and they're already putting forward cuts to frontline health workers and hospitals, exactly what we don't need now. So, I don't know. I'd love to hear more from you, Jamillah, and talk more about what you think sort of under consideration and what we need. You know,
Yeah,
what
so I
else?
wanted to talk a little bit more. We've been hearing about this new legislation that's been proposed with this $2,000 a month for individuals, $4,000 for married couples, additional funds for children. Also, another thing that's been discussed is this canceled rent and mortgage for a year. To me, these types of things make more sense than a one-time stimulus check of $1,200. First of all, it's just taking forever for people to get. And then once they finally get it, in reality, it isn't doing much for most families who have bills to pay and they have people to feed. They have all of this to keep going, to keep afloat. $1,200 is just a tiny drop in the bucket for that. So something like what's proposed would help because people wouldn't have to feel the financial distress over time. It's more than one time. And then they wouldn't feel that pressure to then go out and risk their lives, the lives of their family members at home, as you mentioned before. Also, the lives of others. They can also spread the disease to others at work, to customers, to coworkers. So we wouldn't have that pressure in the middle of this global pandemic if there was more economic security. So I want to talk more about policies or hear more about policies that would lead to overall economic security. You know, we have the unemployment insurance, we have these stimulus checks, but I think that we can have something more holistic like what we're seeing other countries doing. So the UK, Denmark, South Korea, Canada, Australia are doing more like what we see proposed in this $2,000 per month payment.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And some of this is essentially some form or another also of keeping people's paychecks going, right? So you see the Paycheck Protection Program had a lot of problems administered through the Small Business Administration, enacted by the CARES Act, now potentially being refilled by a new bill. But I mean, who does that go to? Even with some of the requirements in there, I mean, the fact is it's going to go disproportionately to fairly well-off businesses who have strong banking relationships and accountants who are quick to help them. You know, that program, for example, would essentially give potentially forgivable loans for up to 8 weeks, up to $10 million for employers with 500 or fewer employees. And you know, only a fraction of those who applied got it. And even this refill amount of it is probably going to be inadequate. There's some incentive certainly for rehiring workers through the potential forgiveness. But you know, a lot of folks are left out, as I pointed out. Could you talk through a little bit about that, Jamillah, about sort of who's left out and why?
Yeah, that's something that's just been extremely frustrating for me because we see this $350 billion. It's given to small businesses. We think, oh, this is a great thing. We're helping our small businesses and then it's forgivable. We're going to use these small businesses to let it trickle down to their workers. So it's also helping all of those workers who are employed by these businesses, but it isn't getting to the people who need it most. So we see Shake Shack and Harvard and Ruth Chris getting $10 million, $20 million from this, and then the funds dry up so quick where really there's so many people who don't have access to it who really need it, these real smaller mom and pops. So part of it is just like I have a big critique of we have this policy and we have this policy written in a certain way and they're saying it's supposed to accomplish something, but in reality, it isn't able to accomplish it. And the people who really need the benefit and the assistance most, they're left out. So that's just one. We'll see what happens once the funds are replenished, whether that there's safeguards to keep that going to the right place. But I'm just not sure. I'm not so optimistic about it, given what I've seen happen in the first round.
And look, Jamillah, everything you just said basically also applies to our paid leave provisions and our paid sick days provisions. The fact is, we have set a lot of very important and useful precedents for sure, such as establishing for the first time federal paid leave requirements, paid sick day requirements. On the other hand, it's not going to go to a lot of the people who may need it the most. So in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, we established 80 hours of paid sick time for COVID-19 related needs, very specifically defined, but full pay. So this is unprecedented in the US, not unprecedented in the rest of the world, but here we are. It took this crisis and we got this. And then it's all temporary, just to be clear. And then 10 weeks of paid family and medical leave for workers who have unmet childcare needs due to COVID-19. That's very specific. and that's 2/3 wage replacement. But then you start digging in a little bit and you look at, well, so who's covered, right? So it's only small and medium-sized employers. I mean, this just baffles everyone really who didn't help enact this carve out for large employers. And then employees have to be employed for at least 30 days for the 10 weeks, though all employees are potentially covered by the 2 weeks or 80 hours of paid sick time. However, the Department of Labor has interpreted this these provisions very narrowly. And on the one hand, on the other, have said, there's an exception for businesses of 50 or less. They can exempt essential workers. And they, by and large, said, we're going to let the businesses determine that themselves. And so what does that mean? That means, according to our friends at the Center for American Progress, an estimated 68 to 106 million private sector workers will be excluded from these provisions that are, again, look, fundamentally, they're public health provisions that are necessary to lay the groundwork for a strong recovery. So again, everything you said about the small business provisions and other aid to institutions really in many cases applies here as well.
Yeah. So that's why I think some better stimulus that goes directly into the pockets of individuals and families so that they're covered and they have some stability and they can stay home if they're sick or their family members are sick is really the solution over this. Outside of that, though, I think the other thing that this really illustrates is how problematic the U.S. our leave policies are generally. Right. So as you mentioned, the U.S. is an outlier. The rest of the world does so much better with this. So even with COVID, it's the first time we've ever issued paid leave. It's temporary. And we know that this is something that also we need policy changes on moving forward, even post-COVID. So similar to unemployment and the other things where we need policy changes for workers, same thing here. There's so many of our workers who are left out. They don't have any paid leave from their employers. They don't have any leave for family leave to help family members or when they give childbirth. This isn't COVID related, but we know 86% of service workers at least don't have access to any paid family leave. So I guess we have the COVID specific issues and we have the broader policy issues that really need to be addressed that are really highlighted and really under the spotlight now, given what we're going through with the virus right now. So I think we're running out of time. I wanted to note some of the resources that we have available. So I know you at the Poverty Center, you have some. I'm going to start just by talking about some of the things we have available through the Workers' Rights Institute at Georgetown Law. We have a website where there are lots of resources and information that are available for people. So I actually wanted to share it. Indi, why don't you start with some of your resources, and I'm going to try to share my screen to actually show some of what we have available for workers.
That's great, and a lot of our work is more focused on policy, but we've got a great brief document on fixing unemployment insurance in response to COVID-19 and one on getting cash to lower income families, as we've discussed here. Our website is georgetownpoverty.org, and in addition to georgetownpoverty.org, you can certainly visit the Law Center website and find the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality and our Economic Security and Opportunity Initiative, which has resources. And in addition, please tweet at us. We're GCPI Econ SEC, or for short for Economic Security, or tweet at me directly at Indivard, INDIVARD, and we'll be happy to engage and connect you with resources. But let me turn it back to Jamillah, because the Workers' Rights Institute does have a terrific resource page for workers.
Yeah, so I just want to bring your attention, if this may be helpful to someone who's watching or one of your family members, please feel free to share this. You can go to Georgetown Law, search Workers' Rights Institute, or go to the the web address you see at the top of the screen. We have lots of policy updates so people can be up to date on the legislation. We have information on unemployment benefits, paid sick and family leave, health and safety, which we talked about. So really many of the things we were in discussion about today, there are resources out there for workers to get help. We also have information specific to certain types of workers. So immigrants, restaurant workers, domestic workers, farm workers. So some of the workers who are more vulnerable, we have information here, as well as more generally other resources, food banks, housing assistance, pro bono assistance if you need legal help here. So it's pretty comprehensive in terms of what we've compiled, and we're keeping that updated. So I just want to make sure people are aware that's a resource that they can go to for more information on all these very important topics that we have discussed for today. So thank you all for joining us. I definitely got a lot out of this conversation with Indi, and we'll just stay tuned to see how this develops over time. But hopefully we're able to provide some good information and resources for you all.
Thank you. I enjoyed it, and things are moving fast. So I'm sure we'll be happy to continue to have this conversation as needed in the coming weeks and months. But thanks for listening, and do follow up or engage with our institutes and centers if we might be helpful.